Well, thank you very much for that introduction and for asking me to give a talk about Francis of Assisi, whose feast day, October 4th, was very recent and whom we're honoring, I think, today with in animal form at some point. Francis is undoubtedly the most famous and popular Christian saint. He's popular with millions who are not Christians. It's not even close. If if sanctity is a beauty contest, he's right at the top. And the reasons for this are multiplex, but they grow out of what is really one of the most remarkable personalities who's ever been on this earth. In order to understand what I'm going to tell you, there unfortunately is a good deal of background about the topic of Christian asceticism. Now, asceticism is the practice of self-denial with spiritual gain in view. And it doesn't play a very large role in the Episcopal Church today, or indeed, it is not a major feature of modern Christianity at all. That's one of the differences between the Christianity of older times and the Christianity of now. I have to begin my talk with a corny story that I often use on occasions like this, which I call my granddaddy's old axe. The fiction is that when my forebears moved from Kentucky to Arkansas, whenever it was a long time ago, they were so poor that they had no physical property except for one old timber axe. And this was so iconic to them over 3 generations that they kept this axe in use and, in the family. And during that time, it had only 2 new heads and 4 new handles, but it is my granddaddy's old axe. Now that is what the Christian church is like. I hope it doesn't shock you to hear. That is, I think if Francis of Assisi could walk into this church, he would recognize it as a Christian church, but he'd say, what a weird church. Where are the votive lamps? Where's the misty this and that? There have been a great many stylistic changes in Christianity and not a few doctrinal changes. If you read the New Testament, which we all do, it should be obvious to you that Paul and others who are writing the epistles think that the world is going to come to an end probably next Tuesday, maybe Wednesday, may make it as far as Thursday. They're living in an apocalyptic expectation of the return of Jesus Christ. And here we are, 2,400 years later, and in a way still waiting, having to reinterpret what that means when we say every Sunday that we believe that Christ will come again. And we do believe that Christ will come again. Well, how is he going to come and when is he going to come and so on. That's one of the big differences between the biblical worldview and our worldview that doesn't really get expressed very often. Now, where are there examples of this life of self-denial or radical asceticism in the Bible? Are there any examples, or is it just something that the early Christians dreamed up? Well, of course there are. Think of Elijah and Elisha. In fact, think of most of the prophets who are desert prophets. That is, they live out in the wilderness and they bring a message in to the cities and towns. And this actually was the way it was in Alexandria and the cities of Egypt in the earliest centuries of Christianity. The model in the New Testament will be very obvious to you. John the Baptist. John the Baptist, such an important, or the baptizer, as we now ridiculously call him, John the Baptizer. Very important person in the life of Jesus. People, in fact, mistook him for the Messiah himself. And he said, no, not me, I'm just the messenger. But what did this guy lived in the desert? He dressed in camel skins. He ate locusts, which are grasshoppers, in case you're not aware, locusts and wild honey, and was, in fact, not a very kind of well-socialized sort of guy. Yet he was the one who was the precursor of Jesus. He was the one who was the sort of emblem of the life of Jesus to come. So these are biblical images. They are there. And I'm going to read you a text in a minute that caused an awful lot of trouble. It is from my favorite chapter of the Bible, the Matthew 19, which I call the all-star chapter of the Bible, because it has all these impossible things in it. And I'll start with one of them. Do you know about spiritual and real eunuchry? The question comes up for Jesus, is it lawful for a man to put away his wife? Is divorce lawful? The answer to that is a categorical no. Now, we live in a world where that is just, it doesn't seem possible to live up to that. And Jesus says it's probably not possible to live up to this. For their hardness of heart, he said, Moses did allow a bill of divorcement to be written in certain cases, because Moses, by reason of the hardness of your heart, permitted you to put away your wives, but it was not so from the beginning. That is, he's holding up an ideal that he says is the ideal. And you don't sacrifice the ideal just because the reality is different. Now, but that's the easy part of this passage. He says, and he said, not all can accept this teaching, but those to whom it has been given. Not all can receive this teaching. Now, the early church, and in fact, our moral theology down to this day, does make a distinction in levels of perfection in the Christian life. He says this, the disciples say, if this is the case of a man with his wife, it is not expedient to marry. And he said, not all can accept this teaching, but those to whom it has been given. For there are eunuchs who were born so from their mother's womb. There are eunuchs who were made eunuchs by men. Think about that one for a minute. That's what happened to Abelard when Eloise's family found out he'd been messing around under the table. And there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of God's sake. Let him accept it who can accept it. Well, who can accept it. Very few. The idea is, Augustine, I think, had the idea that, heaven was not going to be a very crowded place. It's going to take a lot of work to get there. Origen, on the other hand, one of the early church fathers, got in trouble because he believed that everybody was going to be saved. How can a good God damn anybody? That's an argument I like, certainly. Well, that's just the first part of this All-Star chapter. Then you got the rich young man, as he's called in another text. Behold, a certain man came to him and said, Good master, what good work shall I do to have eternal life? And he said, Why do you call me good? Only one is good, God. But if you want to enter into life, keep the commandments. I said, Which commandments? And then he lists the commandments, all 10 commandments. And you know what this kid says? No problem. I've never violated any of the commandments. You don't look shocked enough. He has never violated one of the commandments. I'm very happy for the commandment, thou shalt make no graven image, because by God, I never have made a graven image. I can't make the same claim, unfortunately, about all these other things. And he says, he said, there's still one thing more. Jesus said unto him, If thou wilt be perfect, go, sell what thou hast, and give to the poor, and thou shalt have treasure in heaven, and come, follow me. And there's what I take to be the saddest verse in the whole Bible now follows. But when the young man heard this saying, he went away sad, for he had great possessions. Everybody in this room has great possessions by the standards that Jesus is talking about. Again, there's an ideal that is being held up that seems so unfair, because who can accept it? Who can accept spiritual unity? Who can accept selling everything you have and giving it to the poor? Well, this text is extremely important in Christian history, because so many great men and women kind of just stumbled on it, usually hearing the gospel read at Mass, and decided to take it very seriously. And the first of these was a rich young Egyptian man in the middle of the 3rd century. His name is Antony. And Antony is taken to be the first Christian monk. He walks into church, he hears Matthew 19 being read, and he says, that is being directed directly to me. So he goes home, gets a hold of his notary or his lawyer, says, I want you to sell everything I have, give it to the poor, sets up a trust fund for his sister, and goes out and lives in the desert. And he's a historical figure. This is not a fiction. In fact, he lived to be slightly more than 100 years old, and he is regarded as the father of monasticism. He's the model for all monks. But he lived alone. He lived alone in the desert, in animal caves and so on. It wasn't too long. You go to the 5th century, and you get Benedict of Nursia, who says this idea of radically impoverished living is the right Christian idea, but we can do it in a group. And this is where the so-called Benedictines come from. They were called the Black monks in the Middle Ages, and they're far the most numerous of the medieval monastics. And when you think of your common or garden variety monk sitting, writing in his scriptorium, it's one of these Benedictines that you're thinking of. Thousands of men and women for about 1,000 years were in the monasteries of medieval Europe. Now, Francis, who I'm getting to now, has a compeer in a way. History has a way of sort of moving in groups. And the fraternal movement, as it was called, that is to say, the foundation of the friars, was a very widespread thing. There were many different orders of friars, not merely the Franciscans. Franciscans were the most numerous. The second most numerous were the Dominicans, and they were founded by a Spaniard named Dominic Guzman, and they wore a black outfit. The Franciscans wore a gray outfit. That's why they're called Grey Friars. There are various places still in England that are called Grey Friars because it's where a Franciscan church was. And there was a biblical prophecy of this that certain people saw. When Noah is on the ark and he's trying to find out whether the flood is really over. Do you remember that? He sends out two birds. Does anybody remember what the birds are? A raven, what color is he? A dove, what color is he? Yes, this was a prophecy, according to a lot of these biblical exegetes. A prophecy fulfilled only in the 13th century with the foundation of these orders. Now, Dominic was born in 1170. Francis is born in 1181. They're strict contemporaries. Theoretically, they met each other and were friends. I don't think it's likely, but they really founded two orders that radically altered the life of the church. You can think of the Franciscans in simple terms. I'll call them the activists. They're the people who are going around organizing soup kitchens, et cetera, et cetera. The Dominicans are the great scholars and theologians. And the official theologian of the Roman Catholic Church till this very day is St. Thomas Aquinas, an Italian Dominican. And the corresponding figure among the Franciscans is a very great man, not very well known in our church, unfortunately, St. Bonaventure of Bonareggio. Both of them brilliant thinkers, and Bonaventure in particular, a brilliant writer and administrator. In 1190, Francis is born in 1181. 1181. In 1193, his imaginary girlfriend, Clare of Assisi, is when I say imaginary. They were friends, and Clare of Assisi founded the female order of Franciscans, which has been just as important in church history and cultural history as the male order has been. The reason I said imaginary is because they've been romanticized in various modern stories as though they were boyfriend and girlfriend. She was actually an aristocrat whose, I doubt if her parents would even have talked to Francis of Assisi's parents. Francis's parents were upwardly mobile. We're now in the beginning. You see how the church intersects with material culture and real history. What did people do in the time of Saint Benedict? If you're going to thumb your nose at the world, I'm not going to have anything to do with the world. There wasn't much money around. People didn't have money, or society was not organized according to money. It was organized according to feudal contracts. That is, I swear to be your man or your whatever. So what you did, if you're going to give up all power, is you gave up the power of any authority over your own life. You turned it over to an abbot. And, Father, can I do that? It's sort of re-infantilizing yourself. Now, we're in the 13th century when Francis is born. And he's born into one of the wealthy, increasingly wealthy, sort of small city-states in central Italy, Assisi, like Perugia, way like Florence, which is, of course, larger. His father was a cloth merchant and quite wealthy. And if you have some wealth, the way you show that you don't have any truck with the values of the world is you give up money. So that's what the Franciscans did. And Francis did it in a very dramatic way. He got religion and heard, Matthew 19 on all this, and he decided to give it all away. Now, he didn't have anything to give away, but his father had quite a lot. So he started giving his father's money randomly to poor people. His father decided that this was a rather bad idea, actually. And what you did under these circumstances, the adjudicator would be an ecclesiastic. They called in the Bishop of Assisi and said, have you've been a bad boy if you've been giving away your father's goods? And Francis performed what I call the streak of destiny. He took off all his clothes in the middle of the court, the courtroom, and gave the garment he was wearing back to his father and said, here, I'm giving you everything I have that you have given me. And he picked up a kind of rag, I think he'd set this up in advance, and put it on, sort of piece of burlap, and that was what he was going to wear for the rest of his time. And there are these very tough verses in the Bible that we don't like to read. Whoever loves father or mother more than me has no part in me. Well, that's what these Franciscans thought. Well, there's a radical biblicism at the heart of Francis and the Franciscan movement. That is, his whole life is an imitation of the scriptures in a sometimes naively literal way. I can't give you all the wonderful anecdotes in his life, but as he was setting out, he had a miserable career as a soldier. He was a soldier briefly in a war between Assisi, these are city-states, these little cities all have their armies, between Assisi and Perugia, and the Perugians captured him. He had to be ransomed by his father and so on. And he then thought, I'll go fight in a crusade. And he actually started out to do this, but as he was doing this, he had a vision or an intuition that what God really wanted him to do. He thought he heard the voice of Jesus saying, Francis, repair my church. And so what did he do? There are all these ruined churches, all over medieval Italy. There are all these ruined churches over modern Italy. Well, he found one of them and actually, started putting the stones back together. In other words, he reacted to it in a literal sense. It took him a long time to realize that his mission in rebuilding the church was not going to be that of stonemason, but something else. So there's this tension in Francis between the literal and the figurative. It's very enriching in some ways, but it's very confusing to us in others. He imitated his life, obviously, upon the life of Jesus Christ. For him, what being a Christian was the imitatio Christi, the imitation of Christ. And he did this literally at first, that is, he began getting followers, and he thought, well, Jesus had 12 followers. I ought to have 12 followers. And very quickly, he had 12 followers. But what happens when another 100 or 200 show up and say, me too, I want to be part of this? The growth of the Franciscan order just around the year 1200 is fantastic. It is, and not just the Franciscans, the Dominicans, the Augustinian friars, Carmelite friars, but especially the Franciscans, is really remarkable. But he sees that, obviously this isn't going to be 12 people. What a wonderful guy Francis is, but he was a terrible church administrator. And he came to realize that eventually. Now, if you're living in Italy, that helps. If there are only 12 of you, that helps. Maybe you can live this life of sleeping in ditches and not having any property and so forth. But what if there are 1,000 of you and some of you are in Sweden? And this is what happened immediately. So this literal reenactment of a Mediterranean world of Jesus had to become sort of metaphorical in some way or another. But this tension, as I said a minute ago, between the literal and the spiritual in Francis is very consistent and somewhat confusing. Now, what did the apostles do? Take nothing with you for the journey, says Jesus. Take nothing with you for the journey. Neither scrip nor stave. So, that's my stave. Scrip is a purse. One of the cognate Gospels has a slightly different one. It doesn't mention the stave. Do not put shoes on your feet. One of the cognate Gospels doesn't say anything about whether you have shoes or not. So these huge theological controversies, which seem to us as though they're about how many angels can dance on the head of a pin, become what? I'm not speaking loud enough? Is anybody having trouble hearing me? Okay. I'm sorry. I will speak louder. These extraordinary controversies become iconic theological discussions then in the whole church, and there is this question of the perfect life. If you got to be perfect, can you be married and get into heaven? Looks pretty dubious to a lot of people that could be the case. Can you own any property and get into heaven? That seems a bit dubious to others as well. So there's this perfectionist ethic that is totally unrealistic, that is, however, at the imagistic, the poetic level of very great importance. Fortunately, Francis had some high-powered friends, including two popes. There was a great pope named Innocent III, who was the head of the church in 1215, when one of the most important events in Christian church history happened, the so-called Fourth Lateran Council of the church that took place at the Church of St. John Lateran in Rome. And the church was in pretty lousy shape in terms of its corruption, concubinage of the clergy, ignorance of the clergy, and so on. And Innocent III saw in Francis, and in Dominic as well, the possibility of real agents of reform. And he authorized both of those orders in that council of 1215. Well, back to what is Jesus saying you're supposed to do. Go out, 2 by 2, knock on doors, eat what is put before you. If people aren't good to you, just leave them in the dust, literally. Walk away and shake the dust of that place off your feet. Go to the next place. Preach that the kingdom of God has come among you. So they're preachers. And in fact, the Dominicans, the real title of their order is the Ordo Predicatorum, the order of preachers. But the Franciscans were also great preachers as well. And you probably know some of the lovely stories about Francis. He preaches to the birds. His buddy, St. Anthony of Padua, preaches to the fishes. Do you feel that you're doing that sometimes, George? I wonder. Anyway, why? Because all of God's creation, Francis does have this extraordinarily holistic view of the way nature has been created, which is one of the reasons he's now the great saint of ecology and the ecological movement, and why he's so popular still with young people. But there is a big problem. You probably know the rule. Nothing fails like success. What do you do when you now have 1,000 friars? At least a few of whom are saying, I think I could probably do a better job of running this organization than crazy Francis. Well, the question came up, is it licit for friars to own any property at all? How about a church? Can there be such a thing as a Franciscan church? Well, the proper church authorities were very good at working stuff like that out. That is, they created the legal fiction that the friars didn't own any property. The Pope owned all the property, but he was loaning it to them. And for this reason, you can go to Assisi today, and I strongly recommend you do. Beautiful place. And you will see there a fantastic church that is a multi-million-dollar monument to Franciscan poverty. One of the great ironies of church history. And it's an irony that I think the current Franciscans live with to this day. Now there's the matter of penance. They're a penitential order. The Fourth Lateran Council that I just mentioned a minute ago has a famous decree called Omnis Utriusque Sexus. Everyone of both sexes must go once a year to auricular confession to their parish priest. Okay, this is the first universal commandment in the church that makes sacramental penance necessary. Pretty much disappeared in our church, and it's very much on the wane even in the Roman church. But it was, for many centuries, obviously a very big deal. The power of the confession, that is, a priest who is privy to all your darkest secrets and so on, is a terrible political danger, or moral danger in another way. And it was very financially useful to priests to have the power of confession. So the question was, could the friars be confessors? In fact, they wanted to have a monopoly on it, and they pretty much did. The friars don't have any sort of stable location. They wander around. Now imagine that you are guilty of the sin of sticking beans up your nose, and you just do this, and you know you ought not to, and you keep saying you're not going to, and so on, but you keep doing it. Now, you're faced with having to make a confession. Who do you want to tell about sticking these beans up your nose? Do you want to tell this parish priest who you've been telling the same story to for the last 20 years, and he keeps telling you, don't do this, this is really bad, we can't have you? Or what if some friar kind of wanders into town and says, I'm listening to anybody's confession who's interested, and he has a hat full of little trinkets to hand out to the ladies and so on. This is how Chaucer sees the friars, for example. Well, you'd want to go to that guy, it would seem to me. I'm never going to see him again. He doesn't know I've been sticking beans up my nose for the last 40 years. So there's great tension in the church over this question of the power of confession between ordinary parish priests and the friars. And you had friars who said things like omnis utriusque sexes, everyone of both sexes. This rule applies only to hermaphrodites. Now, the ability of people to follow the letter rather than the spirit of the Bible is pretty manifest in church history. But this is one of the kind of worst things. This is why most of the friars you meet with in secular literature are really bad guys. Chaucer hates his friar. He is a terribly corrupt person, obviously. Dante is full of bad stories about friars. Where would Boccaccio's Decameron be if it weren't for all the randy friars and so on? They're literary caricatures, Let's get back to the real friar, Francis. There's this, he was, as I say, not a good administrator. He had to turn the daily operations over to various people. And one of these, Elias of Cortona, was really sort of on the make. He thought this was, my opportunity to take over the order. And he sort of did. I mean, Francis was going blind by that time. This is in the 1220s. A rich man had given him a mountain in Tuscany, sort of La Verna, Mount Verna, the hillside retreat. And he spent more and more time there on his own. And it was at La Verna that the most extraordinary miracle occurred, according to these texts. and according to the eyewitness testimony of literally hundreds, if not thousands of people, where in the intensity of prayer, Francis discovered that the wounds that Christ would have suffered on the cross appeared within his own body, that is, in his hands, his feet, and his side. And as I say, at the time of his death, hundreds of people walked by his cadaver and testified to this. But this was the unheard of miracle. There had not been a stigmatism in the church. Now it's sort of a dime a dozen. It has been since then. In fact, quite a few years ago now, I was consulted by somebody at General Seminary because they had a woman who was stigmatizing on 9th Avenue. And I couldn't adjudicate this, know anything about it, really, but it is still, in a sense, going on. And it is the major physical miracle in the life of Francis, although he is credited with all sorts of other major miracles. So when you see him in art, and he is one of the great subjects of medieval and Renaissance art, there are many wonderful paintings. I've written a whole book about one of the great paintings of St. Francis, the one by Giovanni Bellini in the Frick collection in New York, where he's standing on the side of Mount Alverna with all the wonderful animals around and so on. And he's actually receiving the stigmata. This is the Franciscan mentality at its own mystical heights. Well, Francis lived and died a poor man. I mean, but he was almost immediately canonized. I don't know if it's the fastest canonization in the history of the Roman Church, but it's pretty close. I think he died in 26, and I think he was canonized in 1227. And so he's now the patron saint of animals. You see him a lot in bird baths and very happy, uncomplicated circumstances like that. He was really a very complicated guy. And in his doctrine of absolute poverty, he holds up, which is simply a repetition of what you get in Matthew 19 and in several other texts. All that you have, give all that you have to the poor. This impossible. You can't possibly mean that. You do mean it, and you don't mean it, sort of at the same time. Anyway, that's Francis. He is, as I say, the all-star saint in the Roman calendar. He's he's one of very few super Roman Catholic saints and there's an Anglican church just up the road dedicated to St. Francis. I don't know other medieval characters who, of the high Middle Ages who have Anglican churches. He's a wonderful, inexhaustible, and impenetrable personality. And everybody since the 13th century has been so eager trying to control the image of him. We want him as a radical poverty guy. We want him as a, mainstream church guy. That it's really hard to to know who he is. I'm going to quit there. And yes, sir.
He obviously had a conversion experience. Could you describe it? I mean, because he didn't wake up one morning and say, "Oh gosh, I'm going to give it all away." Like, did he fall off some horse on his way to Damascus?
Well, I mean, he had, I would say, a series of his. One of the dread diseases of the Middle Ages was leprosy. It's been almost eradicated. It's been, I think, pretty much eradicated in the United States. There are places in the world where it still exists, but it was pretty widespread in the Middle Ages. It is an absolutely horrible disease that disfigures you in horrible ways. And he says, in his own rule, actually says, when I was in my sins, the thought of lepers used to horrify me, like they horrified anybody else. Lepers had to wear bells where you'd ring, so you'd hear the leper coming. Well, one day, he's in one of these narrow streets in a medieval village. If you've ever seen one of them, it's not a lot of room. And he suddenly finds himself right up against a leper. And he embraces this person. I'd say that was, if that is, that's a moment of conversion. Oh yeah, well, yes. I mean, his defeat in his failure as a soldier and being a prisoner of war, I think also had something to do with it. As you probably know, Ignatius de Loyola, the founder of the Jesuit order, also had been a soldier, and in reflection from all the horror of violence that he'd committed and so on, turned to religion.